On May 9, 2016, then President Barack Obama signed a law making the American bison, or the buffalo, the national mammal of the United States. This designation flies in the face of the government's past relationship with the buffalo, a relationship of destruction and total war used as a tool to break the will of the Native American people. At its height, the Thunder of the Plains numbered 30 to 60 million buffalo. In 1884, only around 300 remained. Lieutenant Colonel Dodge depicted this decimation, quoting, "Where there were myriads of buffalo the year before, there were now myriads of carcasses. The air was foul with a sickening stench, and the vast plain which only a short 12 months before teemed with animal life was a dead, solitary desert." Welcome to this series of the podcast, in which we will be listening to stories and interviews with experts about wildlife and conservation. In this first episode, I discuss the story of the buffalo in America, and how these great herds, known once as the Thunder of the Plains, with a population numbering 30 to 60 million, were deliberately and rapidly destroyed as a tool in the war against the Native Americans to a number of only around 300. In episode 2, I speak with an organization dedicated to the concept of rewilding. We discuss how this conservation method differs from others and how its reach extends to not only animals and biodiversity, but also battling climate change and preventing future pandemics. Lastly, in episode 3, I speak with someone on the front lines of critically important ecosystems. We discuss the elusive search for animals that were thought to be extinct and working to understand how we can better assist and change these ecosystems for the future. If you enjoyed what you listened to, have any feedback, or just want to say hello, please help out by visiting The Blunt Report on social media, giving a rating, or subscribing wherever you listen to your podcasts. The podcast is available on all platforms, including video podcasts on YouTube, or can simply be found at thebluntReport.com. A cold wind blew across the prairie when the last buffalo fell. A death wind for my people. Sitting Bull, Lakota Chief. No man did more to seal the fate of the American buffalo than one General Sherman. Sherman was a celebrated veteran from the Civil War who learned some valuable lessons in the concept of total war that he would later employ to solve the so-called Indian problem. His strategies relied on the belief that his army, quote, "must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war." In 1866, Sherman took control of the area known as the Great Plains, in which he witnessed how significant the American buffalo was to the Native American population as their means of subsistence, physically, mentally, and culturally. Later on, in 1869, Sherman took the post of commanding general from the famous Ulysses S. Grant. Only a few months after taking up this position, Sherman formally and publicly proposed that the army should be deployed to specifically slaughter the buffalo. It was reported that General Sherman commented on the fact that if the buffalo were reduced to low enough numbers, they would no longer be able to support the Native American population. This proposal was used as a trial to feel out the government and public reaction in hopes of formalizing something that the army had already been doing in a more informal manner. General Philip Sheridan, for example, friend and close military comrade of Sherman, wholeheartedly agreed with this proposal, as himself, along with the Army's high command, had already seen the devastating effect on the Native Americans of reducing buffalo numbers. Even prior to the legal proposal, the command would regularly outfit civilian hunting expeditions on the plains, providing the would-be hunters with supplies, equipment, escorts for protection, scouts, the Army's guns and ammunition, and just about anything else that was required. These hunting expeditions not only attracted those within America, but rich noblemen from England, and even a particularly luxurious military-sponsored hunting trip hosted by the famous cavalry commander Custer for Grand Duke Alexis, son of the Tsar of Russia. The hunters would slaughter huge numbers of the creatures, with records of guests killing up to 600 animals in a single hunt. And adding to this immense wastefulness, the hunters would subsequently only take the tongues, the hides, and occasionally the humps of the buffalo, while leaving the rest of the animal to rot on the plains. Even on an isolated scale, the army could see how much the lack of buffalo hampered the Native American tribes. This tactic of reducing the buffalo numbers actually turned out to be a kind of catch-all strategy for the commanders of the army. First and foremost, the army was left feeling embarrassed and frustrated at its inability to control the Native American tribes in the types of warfare that they were accustomed to. The Native Americans, with their horses and nomadic way of living, were quoted as being lighter, swifter, and longer range than any of the army's cavalry, which was more bogged down with supplies and a different way of life. This meant that the army could do no more than wound the tribes, who would promptly relocate while never being able to deal any fatal blows. The buffalo were a far more accessible target for the soldiers to strike at and were considered to be an entirely inseparable part of the Native Americans themselves. This sentiment of the tribes and buffalo being entirely intertwined was dramatically displayed by Lieutenant Colonel Dodge in 1867, when he remarked to a hunting party, "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." Additionally, the soldiers themselves were all too keen on targeting the buffalo. With long hours on the front, hunting the animals broke up the monotony of their existence, provided them with a source of undeniably delicious meat, of which the tongues were considered a delicacy to all, and even gave exercise as well as target practice for soldiers learning how to shoot from horseback. In a particularly grotesque case, soldiers at Fort Cobb fired artillery into the herds on their annual migration, killing them by the hundreds. Major General Stanley remarked on the aftermath of the slaughter, saying that, quote, "The weather turned very warm, and the folly of shooting the poor beasts appeared. The putrefying carcasses, by their stench, nearly ran the people out of their post, and for a week the whole command was kept busy hauling carcasses into heaps and burning them." End quote. Not only that, the nature of the buffalo themselves meant that they were extremely easy to slaughter in huge numbers. For an animal that can grow to be almost 1,000 kilograms or more than 2,000 pounds, they evolved in a landscape in which no predator was larger. When danger arises to one member of the herd, instead of turning and fleeing, the other buffalo go towards the source of danger instead, using their immense size and numbers to scare off or crush the would-be predators. While this tactic works against bears or wolves, it is easy to see why humans with guns and ammunition are able to slaughter hundreds of the animals in a given trip. Lastly, this strategy would even serve to further assist in changing the public opinion about the Native Americans. Destroying the buffalo would then, naturally, force the Native Americans to exit their supposed agreed-upon reservations of land in search of wider plains and more food. This, in turn, would foster a determination to oppose the railroads that were being built through the plains as a means of protecting their buffalo stocks. This would give the army yet more justification to assault the tribes due to the need for the railroad, and that the public would view the Native Americans exiting their reservations as a retraction of previous agreements. Just as Sherman had originally anticipated, the killing of the buffalo did far more than just removing a food source from the Native Americans. The great chief Satanta of the Kiowa tribe remarked on seeing the reckless slaughter of the buffalo, quoting, "When I see it, my heart feels like bursting with sorrow." The wastefulness of the treatment of the slain buffalo, in which only the tongues and hides were customarily taken, was particularly disheartening to Satanta, asking, "Has the white man become a child that he should recklessly kill and not eat? When the red men slay game, they do so that they may live and not starve." Although these were early days in terms of the real extinction process of the buffalo, by 1867 it was already being seen that the creatures were disappearing. It was remarked by individuals on both sides that the animals were no longer being sighted in the usual places, the prices of buffalo hides were increasing, and the trails in which they wandered were greening over. This prospect was a great win for some army officials. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock displayed the realities to some of the chiefs he was in contact with, saying, "You know well that the game is getting very scarce and that you must soon have some other means of living. You should therefore cultivate the friendship of the white man so that when the game is all gone, they may take care of you if necessary." It is important to note that there were some within the army who downright disdained this practice, with some even claiming it harmed the objectives of the command, particularly because it made the Native Americans more bound for war than for peace. A Cheyenne chief all but confirmed this notion when he said, quote, "Your people make big talk and sometimes make war if an Indian kills a white man's ox to keep his wife and children from starving. What do you think my people ought to do when they see their cattle, the buffaloes, killed by your race when they are not even hungry?" By 1871, though, the southern herd, one of the great populations of the buffalo in America, received the last nail in the coffin. A tannery in Pennsylvania had worked out how to convert buffalo hides into commercial leather. This began the real extermination of the animal, as hide hunters went through the buffalo herds for profit, supported by the vast railroads that could carry the hides all the way to markets, and the complete sponsorship by the army of supplies and security. Then next, in quick succession, the Central Plains herd was all but wiped out only a couple of years later in 1873. With this decimation of the easily accessible land, the hungry eyes of the hide hunters then turned to the Native American reservations that they were supposedly forbidden to enter by the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867. While hunting in these reservations was not formally sanctioned by the army, it was certainly supported and even assisted by them. When asked by a group of hide hunters what the penalty might be for entering the Native American reservation, Colonel Dodge responded in earnest, "Boys, if I were a buffalo hunter, I would hunt buffalo where buffalo are." He then shook their hands and wished them success. This rapid decline was only beginning to be more widely noticed. A number of individuals in the state legislature of Texas introduced a buffalo protection bill in 1875. The bill would make it illegal for any non-Native Americans to kill a female buffalo or to kill a large number of buffalo for something more than food, with a penalty of $100 for each buffalo killed. Yet, this notion of preserving the buffalo when their slaughter was already proving to be highly effective was not met positively by members of the High Command. Yet again, General Philip Sheridan, the close ally to Sherman, decried the bill. The buffalo killer John Cook recalled in his memoirs that Sheridan said the hide hunters should be awarded, and that Sheridan said, quote, "These men have done in the last 2 years and will do more in the next year to settle the vexed Indian question than the entire regular army has done in the last 30 years. They are destroying the Indians' commissary, and it is a well-known fact that any army losing its base of supplies is placed at a great disadvantage. Send them powder and lead, if you will, but for the sake of a lasting peace, let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffaloes are exterminated." End quote. Ulysses S. Grant, also a supporter of the extermination, went to work vetoing this bill, which then disappeared from existence without another word mentioned. This decimation of the buffalo was not only a military tool to remove the great Native American resource, but was also a step in the direction of what many of the white Americans considered civilization and profitable lands for business owners. A particularly fervent member of the army under Sheridan, one Colonel Nelson Miles, summed up the multifaceted justification of the eradication of the buffalo in some of his personal records, saying, quote, "This might seem like cruelty and wasteful extravagance, but the buffalo, like the Indian, stood in the way of civilization and in the path of progress, and the decree had gone forth that they must both give way. The same territory which a quarter of a century ago was supporting those vast herds of wild game is now covered with domestic animals which afford the food supply for hundreds of millions of people in civilized countries." End quote. With the southern and central herds all but extinct, the last great bastion of both the buffalo and arguably the Native Americans also remained within the northern herd. Previously, it had been too dangerous for hide hunters to venture further north to the lands that supported this herd due to attacks by Native Americans. But with the famed Lakota chief Crazy Horse surrendering in 1877, these lands suddenly became far more accessible. This, again, was supported by the might of the army, with Sherman writing to Sheridan in 1872 about the need to extend the railroad as far north as possible to bring the hunters in and hides out, as it, quote, will help to bring the Indian problem to the final solution. With the army's support, the railroad wound its way directly into the heart of the northern herd at the border between Montana and Dakota, where the final great buffalo slaughter began. A cattleman in Montana, Granville Stewart, remarked on this decimation, saying that, "In many places they lie thick on the ground, all murdered for their hides, such a waste of the finest meat in the world. Probably 10,000 have been killed in this vicinity this winter. Slaughtering the buffalo is a government measure to subjugate the Indians." With the story of the buffalo drawing to a close, both Sherman and Sheridan were satisfied by the rapidity of the work that they had done. During the decline of the northern herd, Sheridan noted to an unknown friend, "If I could learn that every buffalo in the northern herd were killed, I would be glad. The destruction of this herd would do more to keep Indians quiet than anything else that could happen, except the death of all of the Indians." Years later, in Sherman's own memoirs, he wrote a particularly callous passage applauding their success, saying that they had, quote, "in so short a time replaced the wild buffaloes by more numerous herds of tame cattle, and by substituting for the useless Indians the intelligent owners of productive farms and cattle ranches." End quote. The fate of the Native American and the buffalo were entirely intertwined, and the devastation felt by the disappearance of the tribe's source of physical and cultural subsistence cannot be overstated. The effect paralyzed most of the tribes, who would never return to a life that they had lived for generations. As put by Crow leader Chief Plentycoo, "When the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and they could not lift them up again. After this, nothing happened. There was little singing anywhere."